It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to Old Oaks, and I would like to thank the sponsors, the champions, the wonderful organizations, and the wonderful people that have made this morning a possibility. We have very carefully picked a program for you that I think will incorporate both a lot of new information and some cutting edge information about breast cancer prevention and treatment. And we're thinking in new paradigms about the cancer model and how the rest of your body fits in or feeds or prevents a cancer. And we're going to be speaking a lot about that today, I hope, in the panel discussions as well. As Ellen said, the format is that we'll have the 4 speakers. Everybody should be writing questions down, and then after the speakers are done, we'll have a panel discussion as much as time allows, and we'll use your questions. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Elisa Port. And Elisa's a dear colleague. She's the chief of the Breast Surgery Center and the director of the Dubin Center at Mount Sinai. After receiving her medical degree from Sinai, Dr. Port was a general surgery resident at Cedars-Sinai in LA, and then joined Memorial Sloan Kettering for her breast cancer surgery fellowship. And after completing her residency, she came back to MSK, where Sinai stole her away from in 2010. But her work is pioneering work in conservative and new therapies, new surgeries for breast cancer, nipple sparing, sentinel node, and her work in the Dubin Center has really led the way in the city for some very important clinical research and feeds into the basic science research. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome you, Elisa, and you'll speak to us about new innovations in the surgery.
Thank you so much, Orly, and thank you to Yanni and to Ellen for the incredible opportunity to speak to all of you. I am looking for my slides. Let me see. There we go. First of all, I want to thank Breast Cancer Alliance. They've supported my work for a long time now, and we're thrilled to be recipients of one of the fellowship grants. This is one of the most important missions, which is to train the next generation of surgeons, and BCA is really unique in funding those fellowships, and we got to have people to take care of people like me. So the next generation, so that's part of our job. And BCA is unique in their funding of those fellowships and training the next generation and keeping the cycle of great care and cutting edge care going. I want to keep this brief and just give you all kind of an idea and a hint at what's going on in the forefront of all aspects of breast cancer care that I'm involved with, and obviously open for questions later. But I think as a way of introduction, and given that I'm the first speaker, it's important to lay the groundwork for what the scope of the problem is. We know that breast cancer is the most common cancer to affect women in the United States, period. End of discussion. There were approximately 300,000 cases of breast cancer diagnosed in 2017. But here's what people don't know. The death rate from breast cancer between 2000 and 2010 dropped by almost 2% per year. So what does that mean? That means if you were diagnosed after 2010, you were 20% more likely to survive your disease than if you were diagnosed in 2000. And the reason for those advances is because we have moved beyond a one-size-fits-all approach. When we make decisions about how to treat our patients, we look at a variety of different things. Number one, there are patient factors, a patient's age, her family history, which we'll talk a lot about genetics today, the patient's weight, her overall health status, which you'll hear from a lot of our experts about, obesity and so forth. And of course, there's patient preferences. When you have multiple options to offer, what does a patient want to do? And this is one of the most fascinating parts of my job, getting to work with patients in a very collaborative way to decide what are the best options. And then, of course, there are tumor factors as well. The tumor size, lymph node status, whether a tumor is estrogen and progesterone positive or not, whether a tumor is HER2/neu positive, and the imaging findings. And we use these two factors to intersect, to combine into a treatment plan. And again, there's no one size fits all because all of these factors we just discussed are really individualized. For most women diagnosed with breast cancer in 2018, the first order of business is surgery. And treatment can be multifaceted, and most women will need more than one form of therapy. But as the surgeon, I'm usually sort of the gateway to the rest of the treatment options. And we do have so much to offer today. As many people know, lumpectomy is by far the most common surgery done for women with breast cancer, and that's only available to many women because we have done so well in terms of earlier detection, picking up cancers when they're smaller and earlier stage. But many women opt for mastectomy, and many women still need a mastectomy. In the realm of mastectomy, there's still options even within that type of operation. We do both nipple-sparing and non-nipple-sparing approaches. And what's really been exciting is as we've moved into the nipple-sparing approach, there are lots of options, believe it or not, even in terms of incision placement. Can we do a minimally visualized scar underneath the breast? Can we do it out laterally? And these have huge implications for aesthetics, which we now have the luxury to talk about and to prioritize, which is critically important to me and most of my patients. I'll touch on chemotherapy and systemic treatment a little bit because what's really cool for me is that as the person who usually sees a person diagnosed with breast cancer first, it's often a surgeon's decision about whether or not to send someone for other kinds of treatment first. And we have all of these options. I wrote up here, neoadjuvant chemotherapy versus primary surgery. My job is to look at the individual patient, look at her particular tumor size and type and location and characteristics, and decide whether or not that person can actually benefit from having treatment first, and how will it impact downstream treatment. So for example, triple-negative breast cancers, which are a particularly aggressive form of breast cancer, and HER2-positive breast cancers, we know now, if we treat up front with treatment, we may actually affect their surgical options down the line by shrinking the tumor, and you can convert women from mastectomy to lumpectomy and so forth. We also have, we're talking about hot topics, for estrogen and progesterone positive patients, there's a clinical trial that's ongoing that we at Sinai participate in called the alternate trial, where we give women a trial of endocrine therapy upfront, see how the tumor responds, and that can also modulate the options that we have for them for surgery down the line. We also have a lot to discuss with our patients and a lot we can talk about here regarding adjunctive imaging, PET scanning, MRI. As imaging improves and continues to improve, we can do so much more for our patients with those types of techniques. One of the huge areas of advancement in breast cancer diagnosis and treatment has been genetics. The BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes here, which of course were made very, very popular and are much well known by many celebrities talking about them in the media, but we've been testing for the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes since the mid-1990s, 1994, 1995. Everyone thought at that point that on a yearly basis some new gene would roll out and we would find BRCA3 and BRCA4. That has not been the case. However, we have in current day identified other genetic predisposition genes like PALB2, CHEK2, ATM. And today, in 2018, instead of sending someone just for a BRCA1 or BRCA2 test, we do a panel of gene tests. And what makes our work so interesting is that these genes, PALB2, CHEK2, and ATN, may not be associated with as high a risk of breast cancer as BRCA1 and BRCA2. They're intermediate somewhere. But it makes some very, very nuanced decision-making with our patients. And so for most women today who were tested pre-2013, we're actually going back to the drawing board and retesting many of them who tested negative for all of these other genes. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Well, what's so important about finding out that you're predisposed to breast cancer, ovarian cancer, other cancers? Because we can do a lot about this. Number one, we can embark on high-risk surveillance programs for these patients. But number two, we can also intervene surgically to reduce the risk of getting breast cancer by performing what we call risk-reducing or prophylactic mastectomy. This is one of those, and I hope you guys over there can see a little bit. This is one of those, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Of course, without naming names, this is a patient, I don't know if you can see from there, but the top is before and the bottom is after. This is a person who's in the public eye, who came to me with a known BRCA2 mutation and said, I have to be in not very much clothes on TV in about 3 months. Where does that leave me for surgery? And as you can see here, these photos below are 1 month post-op and of a nipple-sparing mastectomy done through an incision on the undersurface of the breast. Anybody want to get a closer look? When we're very proud of the work that we can do to offer anyone who cares about how they look and their body and their image and so forth, a really excellent result while doing everything they can to reduce their risk of getting a breast cancer in the future. While doing a prophylactic mastectomy is not a decision to be taken lightly, the one thing that we say is that anyone with a known genetic mutation who gets breast cancer is a failure of prevention. We knew there was something going on. They had a 90% chance of getting the disease, and we or they did not intervene. So this is an option that we're obviously incredibly proud of offering. There have been advancements in targeted therapies for women with more advanced stage breast cancer. As I mentioned, estrogen and progesterone are obvious targets, and we've had medications targeted at the estrogen and progesterone receptor now for almost 50 years, but the number of options has expanded along with reducing the side effects. And so if women fail their first line of estrogen and progesterone therapy, we have much to offer down the line. There are more drugs like this coming down the pipeline. The same for HER2 new therapies. Immunotherapy is a wonderful new avenue for exploration in breast cancer, done independently and in combination with chemotherapy. Foundation medicine testing is a kind of tumor profile testing where we can identify actionable targets in tumors and newly derived, basically, therapeutics aimed particularly at one's individual tumor. And patient-derived xenograft is something I'm really excited about, which is very kind of space-age treatment where you take a piece of someone's tumor, implant it in an animal model. Please don't put this on any kind of PETA website or anything like that. We feel we know research in animals is very controversial, but in this work that we're doing in mice, we feel that it's critically important in terms of advancing overall cancer care. Where we implant a piece of the tumor in an animal model, grow it out, and can figure out before giving a patient any kind of treatment what kind of therapies work. So we can stack the odds in the patient's favor that we're actually giving them a treatment for work. And this is particularly important in certain subtypes of cancers where we don't know what the best therapy is, like triple-negative breast cancer. And lastly, there are many other treatment advances, too numerous to name in this short forum. We are doing more and more what's called intraoperative chemotherapy for selected patients with breast cancer. Most of you know that if you have a lumpectomy, radiation is usually part of the package to follow. Radiation can take 6 weeks in newer courses, and you'll hear more about this from Dr. Formenti, who's built her life's work around this. In shorter courses, we can give it for 3 weeks, but there are technologies where actually at the time of lumpectomy, you can implant a device, give a blast of radiation, and then the patient is done. And while here in New York, in the New York metropolitan area, we're so fortunate to have radiation centers basically everywhere, you can imagine what a huge thing this is for people who live in the Ozarks or Kentucky, where the closest distance to a radiation center may be 4 hours away. And the difference between their being able to get a lumpectomy or not is doing this type of treatment. Liquid biopsies are a huge area of investigation where we're tracking response to treatment vis-a-vis blood work. And lastly, what's really, really exciting is we at the Dubin Center are involved in a trial called the COMET trial, which is what we like to call de-escalation trial. We know there's been a lot of controversy about DCIS. Is it cancer? Is it not cancer? How do you treat it? Do you overtreat it? Do you undertreat it? Well, a lot of people are involved in investigating this line of work, and we're involved in a trial where basically we are watching and waiting and observing patients with selected low-grade DCIS to see how it progresses. So we'll be able to tell, hopefully within the next few years, are there patients where this is a non-life-threatening disease that we can forego treatment in and have it not jeopardize their overall well-being. So that's my introduction. Happy to answer any questions later. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Engen. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elisa. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions about testing and other surgical options for us. Our second speaker is Dr. Lee Jones, who's a member and attending physiologist in the Department of Medicine and the director of the Exercise Oncology Research Program at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Dr. Jones completed his PhD and postdoc fellowship in exercise physiology at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and he joined MSK in 2014. His research focuses on a translational approach to the investigation of exercise. We all know exercise is good. We all know being fat is bad. But and that's why no one's eating the cookies on the front table. But that all said, what's the link? And why does exercise make you more well, make you better able to fight a disease, to do better in treatment? Not just because you look better and you went to the gym that day. There's got to be a in-between step. And we're going to hear from Dr. Jones what kinds of lifestyle modifications we can and should be making, and what data exists to support the utilization of those lifestyles. So without any further delay, Dr. Jones, it's a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Okay. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So even though I did all my training in Canada, better be careful there, I don't want to fall off the podium. I'm actually English, so if my accent's a little bit funny here and there, I apologize in advance. So I'm just going to take the next 7 or 8 minutes just to talk about this new field of research, which we're calling exercise oncology. Quite honestly, that's a term we made up, but it's sticking. So I was at Duke for about 8 years, and then I've been here at Memorial Sloan Kettering for the past. Some Dukies, some Blue Devils in the house. That's good. Shame about the NCAA tournament this year, but that's okay. Okay, so I'm just going to get right into it. I'm not going to give you much of an introduction. I'm just going to talk specifically about our research program. We really focus on 2 fundamental things in our research program. Now, exercise does many things. And we're certainly aware of those things, but we just focus on two important facets of our research. The first is we're very interested in using exercise as a form of treatment to help control the cardiovascular side effects of cancer therapy, particularly breast cancer therapy. As we heard, breast cancer patients now are living much longer than they ever have, and this is, of course, something to be celebrated. The problem with that is now we're starting to see all the ugly side effects of therapy lasting a lot longer than they have, so we're very interested in using exercise to try and prevent or mitigate those side effects. The other side of our research program, which is really a newer side of our program, is can we use exercise as a form of cancer treatment itself? Okay, so first the cardiovascular toxicity research. Well, as we know, as we just heard, a breast cancer patient can receive many forms of different types of therapy as part of their treatment. And for us, we really think about this. I'm a physiologist by training, so we really think about what these treatments can do across multiple organ systems within the body, within the cardiovascular system. And we know that these treatments can cause a range of toxicities, either to the lungs, to the heart, to the muscle, to the blood vessels, to the vascular system. And so there's this profound impact across the entire cardiovascular system. So we were very interested in trying to quantify and characterize what these different types of therapies do to the overall cardiovascular function of a woman who's going through different types of breast cancer treatment. So what we found is if we look at somebody's cardiovascular function, and the way that we can measure that in our program is by measuring somebody's exercise capacity. If we look at their exercise capacity before they start treatment and then at the end of their treatment, which can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, what we see is their fitness will decline about 10 to 20% in just 3 to 6 months. And you're probably thinking, well, Lee, of course it does. They're going through therapy. That's to be expected. I think what's important is we typically see a 10 to 20% decline in somebody's fitness in normal women in about 10 years. So what I'm saying is 3 to 6 months of chemotherapy or radiotherapy is essentially the equivalent of 10 years of normal aging. This is how rapid these treatments can affect the cardiovascular system. So you're probably thinking, well, this is during treatment. It probably recovers after, spontaneously recovers. And what we found, unfortunately, even if we looked at women who are 3 years following the completion of their chemotherapy, their fitness level remains about 30% below women of the same age who haven't had breast cancer, who are completely sedentary. So it appears that you get this dramatic decline during treatment, and it doesn't appear to recover. This can then increase the risk of things like cardiovascular disease in these women. We know that breast cancer survivors have about a 30% increased risk of cardiovascular disease relative to women who've not had a history of breast cancer and breast cancer treatment. And of course, one of the most common symptoms we hear from our patients is fatigue, tiredness, and I really believe that's related to this deconditioning that happens during their cancer treatment. So that's the bad news. The good news is I believe we can do something about it. And of course, my treatment of choice is exercise, and exercise because it is really a multifactorial intervention. It doesn't just improve cardiac function, it improves the entire system. So in our research, what we found, if we see this dramatic decline during treatment, if we exercise people during their chemotherapy, yes, and we've done this, we actually completely prevent that decline that you see with chemotherapy alone. Completely. We make it disappear. Also, at the same time, women are improving better quality of life. In the fatigue, they don't feel half as fatigued as the women who are randomized to just getting their chemotherapy only. In terms of the long-term benefits, we have shown that exercise can not only prevent the decline during treatment, but if we take women who've completed their treatment, we can get them back to where they were before they started their treatment. We can get them back to where they were at baseline, at their diagnosis. We also know that exercise in breast cancer patients can decrease their risk of cardiovascular events, anywhere to 30 to 50%. And we've also just published a paper showing that it can also decrease late mortality in these individuals as well. So exercise, that's not too bad. Okay, so we've been looking at the role of exercise also as a form of cancer treatment itself. Now, many of you probably know that exercise has been associated with decreased risk of many different types of cancer, not just breast cancer. So if you look at breast cancer, those women who report exercise have about a 30 to 40% reduction in the risk of postmenopausal breast cancer. But there's this study that was published just a couple of years ago. This was in 1.4 million Americans that showed that exercise reduced the risk of 13 different types of cancer. So this is really the beautiful thing about exercise. It improves the organ function and decreases risk across multiple organ systems all at the same time. Now, there's also been some research over the past 5 years or so that looking at the relationship between post-diagnosis, so this is exercise levels after a diagnosis of things like breast cancer, and then the risk of cancer relapse or recurrence, as well as the risk of dying for things like breast cancer. This data here is presented. This is what's called a forest plot. Essentially, what we see is those women who report exercise have about a 30% reduction in the risk of their cancer coming back, and about a 30% reduction in the risk of dying from their breast cancer, compared to women who report no exercise at all. Now, we have to take this research with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because this is women reporting how much exercise they do. And as we know, we tend to over-report how much exercise we do, under-report our weight a little bit. It's okay, it happens. So there could be many reasons why there's an association. There might be many factors that we're not controlling for in these analyses. But I do think this data is very encouraging. But of course, if this was a drug, what we would do next is we would test it in animal models. So we do research also in animal models as well, because we want to prove that exercise is having a biological impact on things like breast cancer. So this is a study we just completed. We just published a study recently. And I'll just say that we do exercise mice, and we've got treadmills for mice. Yes, we actually do this. And we can train 6 mice at a time. And because it's a treadmill, we can control the speed and how many times. So we can train mice 5 days a week, an hour at a time. And they run about 18 meters per minute, which is a moderate intensity exercise program for a mouse. They kind of like it. A mouse, by the way, if you put a wheel in a cage and you turn the lights off, a mouse will run 3 to 5 miles a night. They love it. And so we can randomize these animals with different types of breast cancer, either to an exercise group or to what we call sham exercise. So the mice in the sham exercise group get put on the treadmill, but we don't turn it on, so they get the same environmental exposures. What's interesting about these 3 cell lines here, all different types of triple-negative breast cancer. And what we found is, in these animals, we give them the same uniform exercise dose, but the response to exercise was completely different across these 3 different cell lines. In this first group here, we found that exercise was associated with about a 40% inhibition of tumor growth rate. This is just exercise alone. This is not exercise with chemotherapy. It's just exercise alone. In this middle group, exercise was associated with a reduction, but it wasn't nearly as profound. And then in this final group, exercise wasn't associated with an effect whatsoever. So this is within triple-negative breast cancer, you see these different effects. And the reason I'm saying this, I think it goes back to the first comment, is it isn't one size fits all. We often hear that exercise works for everything, but it isn't true. There's very different effects as a function of the biology of the disease. So that's really where our program is starting to go, is really trying to understand the biology of the disease and then tailoring the exercise intervention to not only to that person, but also to the biology of their cancer. So this work is now provided, I think, the foundation for clinical trials. We've done a lot of clinical trials in the past that have been mainly focused on those cardiovascular endpoints. We're now doing trials really focused on looking at exercise effects on tumor biology itself. And I just want to make the point here that we're doing trials across the entire breast cancer continuum. So we have now a high-risk trial underway right now at Memorial Sloan Kettering. This is an NIH-funded trial, 4-arm randomized controlled trial, looking at different doses of exercise in women who have either got BRCA1, BRCA2 mutations, they've got a family history, or they've got a history of atibia. What we're doing in this study is we're taking pre- and post biopsies of the breast, pre- and post-exercise, and we're looking at the changes in their biology, in the tissue biology, in response to exercise. No one's ever done this before, so we're very excited by this study. This study's ongoing, and it's going very well. We're also just about to start another study where we're taking the pre-operative period, so in the period between diagnosis and surgery. It's about a 4-week period, depending on the institution, and we're going to exercise individuals in that period just for 4 weeks. And that way we can get tissue before and after exercise, and we can look at changes in biology. We've also looking at exercise training during neoadjuvant treatment that was mentioned earlier. We've got studies in the post-treatment setting. You heard about this concept called a liquid biopsy. This is where we can take individuals who have got circulating levels of something called circulating tumor DNA. We can then track that in blood. We can take these individuals and then track, just through a blood draw, how their tumor is responding to exercise. And we're also doing research in women with advanced breast cancer as well. So just for the final couple of minutes, I've mentioned a lot about exercise, but I really haven't talked about what I mean by that. And probably in this room, exercise might mean something different to everybody. And I think there's exercise, and then there's exercise. Hopefully, I'm going to tell you about the latter. So in our program, we take exercise very seriously. We don't just give somebody a pedometer and say, walk around the block a few times a week, tell us what you did. We really don't think that's exercise. What we do is we bring every single individual in our clinical trials into our labs in Manhattan, and everybody does a baseline cardiopulmonary exercise test. This would be the same test that an athlete would do before going to the Olympics. We use that to really get a gold standard measurement of their cardiorespiratory fitness. We can then look at their response to exercise, their cardiovascular response to exercise, and this is individual for everybody who comes in. We then use that information to design an individualized exercise prescription. Now, we often get the question of, should I be doing low-intensity exercise, moderate, or high-intensity? You know, do I just need to do 4 minutes a day at 100% and that's enough? A bit like a Soul Cycle class. No offense to Soul Cycle, it's wonderful. But the answer to that question is you need to be doing all of those things. You need to be exercising at low, moderate, and high intensity. And this is what we'll do across our program, is really sequencing the intensity and duration of exercise so it's continued changing across the life of the study. And that's called a nonlinear exercise training approach. And then, of course, if we do a good job of putting together a prescription, we need a really good way to deliver the exercise prescription. And we've really got two ways that we do that. So the first way is for individuals who live in Manhattan. We have our own exercise clinic in Manhattan. This is on 68th and 1st. In every single exercise session is one-on-one with our team of exercise physiologists, every single session. And it doesn't come in, there's not a negotiation. This is your prescription for your day, just like it would be your treatment, and this is the dose of exercise that you're going to get. And every single time it's quantified. But we also know, of course, that many individuals don't live in Manhattan and won't travel into the city 3 to 4 days a week to come exercise with us. But Memorial has 8 hospitals out in the network, so we've just developed an approach that we can actually now deliver exercise to people anywhere in the tri-state area. And we call this our TeleX approach. So what we've done is we now own a fleet of 50 treadmills. So we bought 50 treadmills. These are all Technogym treadmills. We then deliver the treadmill to the person's house. So there's no excuses. So the treadmill goes to the person's house. We set them up with a bunch of different devices. And then every single session is monitored, still one-on-one by exercise physiologists. Each treadmill comes with an iPad. We use something called Cisco Jabber, which is kind of like Skype. Then every single exercise session is monitored by our exercise physiologists sitting in Manhattan, and these patients could be exercising anywhere in the tri-state area. This is happening right now. We've also just gone to our second phase of this. We can monitor now 3 patients at the same time with one exercise physiologist, multiple different locations. We call this our virtual training space. And then the final thing that we're doing now is what we call our digitized clinical trial. So in this context, we're now tracking the changes, the dynamic changes in someone's physiology in their tumor in response to exercise. But the way that we identify patients, the way that we consent them, deliver exercise, and collect all the materials is all done completely remotely. The patient doesn't have to come into Memorial one time. We go to them to collect blood, all the tissues, we're collecting microbiome, and we can do this, and we're also collecting continuous information in terms of how much physical activity they're doing, their blood pressure, their weight, and their sleep and their diet. But this is all remote through devices. So this is something that we're doing right now. So just to summarize, I've reported that cardiovascular toxicity is an important side effect of breast cancer treatment. We consider this to be a model of accelerated aging, where exercise can completely slow down this process. Exercise might inhibit tumor initiation as well as progression. I didn't mention this, we're also shown that exercise can improve treatment response. But really where we're going to is really the personalization of exercise. Which patients should we be intervening on? what's the optimal dose and schedule of exercise, and then, of course, how does it work to really optimize the safety and efficacy of this approach. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Adam Yalla, and he's a PhD candidate in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT. He's a member of the MIT Natural Language Processing Group, and his research lie in the intersection of natural language processing, machine learning, and applications to diagnostic testing, particularly annual mammography. His work has been deployed at Mass General, and he's been a recipient of multiple awards for his pioneering work. And he's going to speak to us about the use of artificial intelligence in making mammography a better test. Adam.
Thank you for the introduction. So one big problem from a computer science perspective and how we think about breast cancer is that we lose too much information along the way. So looking at the general treatment flow, we start with these incredibly rich signals, things like a pathology slide or a mammography image that has many millions of pixels, and we summarize that into a few hundred words into a mammography report or pathology report. We go from that very rich signal and summarize it again into a few categorical variables that we know matter, like ER, PR, and grade. And from there, we make our treatment options. The trouble with that is that at each step along the way, we lose information. And for the exact same features, we can have very different outcomes, meaning we're losing too much. And so at the patient level, we lose too much information. And at the population level, we're only using a tiny percentage of the information that's out there. So all of our knowledge, more or less, is based off of 30% of patients on clinical trials. And that's not a random 3%. It's 3% that's tightly controlled, that has no dirty covariates that exist in the real world. And so the general direction of the lab that I'm part of at MIT is changing this paradigm, looking at the whole population, and from the raw data to say, can we predict the actual outcomes at the end, things like recurrences, detect things like cancer earlier, and sensitivity to treatment. So the first challenge in this, in doing this prediction task, is solving the, what are the outcomes? Can we even say what's happened to all of the patients to do this kind of thing at scale? The first challenge with that is that the outcomes are locked in free text. And so if you want to know what happened to the many hundreds of thousands of women that are affected, it's not just a little database query and you just have it there. In general, when people do retrospective research, they read these reports by hand, they type it into Excel one by one, and it's a very labor-intensive process, and it's the bottleneck of how we do retrospective research today. Now, we can treat this as a simple machine learning problem. So we can treat the aspects of actually how do you understand what's happening in the medical record, and how do you track what happened to all the patients as an extraction problem and do this automatically. Long story short, we did. This was a project of mine a couple summers ago. Essentially, we built this database over, at first, breast pathology. Now we spread it across more organs. And essentially, we can say, for things that we know matter, what was the diagnosis? What were the histological factors? What else we find? What was the margin size? Were there lymph nodes found positive, et cetera, at the time? And we did this, you train in a couple thousand, and you can run this now across hundreds of thousands. And so now we have a very rich database of outcomes. Now, what does that give you? We'll let you study things at scale and find signals otherwise not there. In the current state of the art, even at top journals like New England Journal of Medicine, the normal sample size you'll see for a study is like 300 to 600. With this kind of thing across a single sensor, you can easily get a sample size of 6,000 because you have the full 400,000. Oh, keep doing that. And you can just run the query and see what comes out. And so this really lets you accelerate research. So once you have these databases, what can you do given what we already know of things that matter? Well, it can do things like reduce over treatment. So one of the first projects we worked on was looking at high-risk regions, things like ADH. The current standard of care at MGH, at least, is 100% of them get excised, even though only 13% of them will be found with something in the end. And so we looked at, given we have the scale, we have thousands of patients, even considering, without even looking at the images, we looked at the report text and these categorical variables, can we predict who won't need the surgery at all? And so for that, this is a very simple model. We got about a 30% reduction in unnecessary surgeries. And this is just the beginning because we're not even looking at the images yet because at the time we didn't have access. This is enabling many new papers. This is also at MGH. Given this database, we're just sharing it out there. The code for that is open source and freely available. All these nice computer science things. And now, because of that, we can enable many people to skip the 2-year curation stage and just ask the questions. And this is, for us, an exciting direction. Still within the paradigm of things we know, there's things like breast density we know matter as a risk factor, things like background parenchymal enhancement and breast MRI that are known to matter, but are plagued by their subjectivity and how variable they are across the country. Depending on the center, some radiologists might call 80% of breast dense, some might call 20% of the breast dense, and so what does it even really mean? To rectify that, we developed some machine learning tools to kind of learn the mapping, and now we can do those. I'm going to skip the numbers, but we can do them at essentially human performance with specialized breast radiologists, and these tools are also going to be shared publicly for free for anyone that's interested in using them. And there's a video I'm going to skip of that deployment. It actually sits at MGH now. But really what we want to do is we want to, instead of part of the problem just making more data available and kind of bridging the 3% gap, the next step is really saying from the raw signal, how much can we predict of what's going to happen? The power of machine learning is really, we have tools that can fit almost arbitrary functions given enough data. And so instead of relying on what we already know that matters, things like ER and PR, can we learn the function from scratch given the data? And so there's many problems with the shape. The first problem is that predicting an occurrence of pathology-confirmed cancer within a year. There are some numbers here that they don't really matter too much as of right now because they change every week. We make some modeling improvements. As we get more data, these numbers go up. We have some good preliminary numbers on how we detect cancer now. But the more exciting thing is looking forward, what can we predict that currently can't be predicted? So in many cases, let's say you're diagnosed in 2014, there's actually a recent study about this where 30% of the cancers found in a particular study, if you look back a year ago, they can actually see it in hindsight. And in this case, this is actually the mammograms of my PhD advisor, Regina Barzilay. She was diagnosed in 2014. And you can actually see the lesion develop in 2 years. Now, it was missed in 2012, it's missed in 2013, it was diagnosed in 2014. But it's super hard to do that in foresight. This is an incredibly complicated pattern. Lots of things are changing. As you age, the actual texture map itself will change. As your weight changes, everything changes, and so it's incredibly hard to say that in foresight. But the signal is there, and so what we're working on is learning this mapping automatically and say, can we detect 2 years in advance or 3 years in advance? A very similar kind of project, if you can characterize the way the tissue is changing over time, we're looking at. It's a natural generalization of the 1 year and 2 year task. Can we predict 10 years? Can we do a more personalized idea of risk that's not based on things like age or race or these known factors, but based on the actual pixels of the tissue and what we can determine from that? And then information subsumes a lot of the other risk factors. From the mammogram, I can predict the race fairly reliably. A lot of the things about age are captured in those pixels. The next thing that we're also working on, this is concurrently, and we're still getting data for this, is given this progression, can we predict sensitivity to treatment? Which things will work and not work? If you can say for which subset of this kind of phenotype that we know of, as my basic concomitation features, this will work or won't work, this can drive new areas of inquiry in terms of figuring out what's the biological factor that makes it underneath. And I think one of the most promising things about this entire line of work is that because this is an algorithm, and this is in the end, I write some code and then some numbers are crunched, but this is reproducible completely. And so right now we're in a situation where the standard of care across the states, this is the map of incidence and mortality across the country, and you can see that your standard of care is almost a function of geographic location. Depending on where you are, you have very different outcomes. And in part because as we do this process manually of figuring out at each step, how do we summarize the signal, we lose a lot, and the quality of that summarization is very different. With these kind of tools, I'm very excited and every step along the way, we're making these things openly available online so people can and different clinics can kind of send images in and get out outputs. We can really make this a consistent standard of care across the country. That's it.
Our last speaker this morning, before we kick off our panel discussion, is Dr. Sylvia Ferling. And Sylvia is the chair of radiation oncology at Weill Cornell Medical College. It's a pleasure to be her colleague. She's an amazing researcher, an amazing clinician, and she's devoted her entire career to understanding some of the mechanisms of the effectiveness of radiation therapy in cancers. And it's not simply just burning the tumor as we used to think. It's actually sensitizing the body against the tumor either genetically or immunologically so that the body's own defense system can fight the tumor. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sylvia Ferling, and she'll tell us a little bit about her work in radiation oncology and immunotherapy in breast cancer.
I'm going to take just a few minutes of your attention, and I thought was useful to refocus on, first of all, I apologize in advance about my accent, which is not from Manchester, but so I'll try to speak slowly. But I want to talk a little bit about the cancer problem, give you a larger frame. And this is a slide that I find very humbling as an oncologist, because it just shows the proportion. It's not complicated, I promise you. It shows the proportions of Americans. Every 100,000 Americans that die, what do they die of? And we all have to die, so it's kind of interesting to see whether we made progress in reducing as cause of death one disease versus another. And it shows from 1958 up to 2010, and I promise it's the same in 2018, how the diseases of the heart as cause of death went down. Then we see a little bit more Alzheimer's disease just because we're better at diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. Before it was just a general diagnosis of dementia or old age and so on. We were not capable to really make the diagnosis. But disease of the heart went down. And what is humbling is that malignant neoplasm, cancer, is flat. So with the amount of money, energy, and it's not that all the bright people went into cardiology, all the stupid people went to oncology. It may be possible. I mean, artificial intelligence may tell us, so it'll be humbling. But with all this Nobel Prize in oncology and in basic science about cancer and immunology and so on, it's hard to believe that we got selected to be incapable to solve the problem. So one can say the problem is more complicated, which is, possible. But it's also possible that we need to break the mold. We need a paradigm shift. And the good news is that the paradigm shift is happening, and is happening through understanding the crosstalk of the immune system with cancer. It's not that we were not studying it before, we were, but somehow not from the right angle. And 10 years ago, approximately, there was really a breakthrough, maybe 20 years ago, there was a breakthrough in that direction that enabled us to look at cancer in a completely different way. I just want to talk about breast cancer because it's true the breast cancer's risk of dying of breast cancer has gone down a bit, but over the past 20 years, but not as much as to let us declare victory. We're not there yet. And also, I want to say that what is really comforting is that even in women who have recurred with breast cancer, when the disease comes back, they are much more likely to see, 20% more likely to be alive 5 years from their recurrence. So that's really a triumph. So we're much better, and it's probably true across all cancers, we're much better at keeping people alive and most of the times well with their disease. But at the end, the proportion of Americans who die of cancer has not changed in 60, 70 years. So how are we going to look at it from a different angle? And this is the new different angle. I'm sorry, I'm not so sure how easy it is to see from your table. But it turns out that focusing the attention on how the immune system looks at cancer seems to be the key. And in fact, the immune system is our best friend, and particularly through aging and exposure to whether it's sun for skin cancers versus, pesticides, many causes that increase, many causes of toxic versus chemical versus radiation-induced cancers that we are exposed to throughout life from birth on. At each single step, the immune system senses that insult and is our best friend in eliminating the cells that are now modified by these cancerogens, this kind of causative, responsible agents for cancer. And it's successful most of the time, but clearly not all the time, since 1 out of 2 men in America throughout their life will have to fight cancer, and one out of 3 women will have to fight cancer. So I know it's excruciating, but if you look around, the table, there's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. One form of cancer will occur approximately in a third of us. We like to think it's skin cancer, the ones that with most surgery you remove and is gone, but there are also other cancers, including breast cancer, of course. And what the immune system does is, by recognizing the cells that are not self, figures out a way to reject them. In other situations, it recognizes the cells as non-self, but is not really capable to fully reject them. And that's in the middle there, and is a state of equilibrium, whereby there is a cancer cell in the body, and this is very similar to ductal carcinoma in situ in the breast, and is kept at bay somehow, not to evolve throughout the entire lifetime, in most of the cases, to become an invasive cancer. It's the same for some very low-grade prostate cancer. But unfortunately, in a sizable proportion of patients, eventually the immune system gets confused. And what is fascinating is not just the immune system failing, is the cancer also harnessing the immune system to grow in a funny way. It's making the immune system look at itself, the opposite way of an autoimmune disease. So what we have learned in the past 20 years, that is cancer is a disease not only of the cells that make the mistake, the way we used to say, but is also a disease of the immune system, not being capable to reject that cell. So now the targets are 2, the cell that makes a mistake and the immune system. And of course, as you know, you see it on New York Times all the time, that there is a big interest of pharma to embrace this concept, because now you look at 2 different enemies, in theory, the broken immune system as well as the cancer. And most importantly, you start learning their crosstalk and how it evolves. So we got interested, as I said, the result of ESCAPE is a less immunogenic tumor in a more tumor immune-tolerant host. And at that point, the cancer is just ignoring the immune system, and it can evolve to invasion and, in some cases, metastasis, and eventually the demise of the patient. So, the patients who recur are the ones who are the dearest to me. Over the years, I've been extremely fortunate to take care of extraordinary women, and it really made my job. I'm the luckiest woman on earth. I really love what I do. But the ones who recur are the ones that have my heart. They are really my heroes. And I really want for them to convert their disease into a chronic condition. It looks like we're not capable to cure them. I would love to make their tumor go away completely, but I'm ready to settle, to make it chronic enough that they will have to die. They will die of something else. Okay? So how do we get to the point of understanding the escape when the tumor takes over and harnesses the immune system to help itself, instead of fighting it? And how we revert that condition to now make it chronic, make it kind of smoldering and not bothering, not interfering with life, the way we live with a little bit of arthritis, a little bit of, maybe a slightly congestive heart failure, but like just congestive, kind of minimal high blood pressure. Look at it that way. But it's not going to be our cause of death. So we were very fortunate because we approximately 19 years ago, as a matter of fact, we discovered that you can use radiotherapy to convert the tumor, to try to bring back the tumor to be now immunogenic. So in that image I showed you before, where from equilibrium you go to escape, you can make the tumor you can render the tumor more detectable and more foreign to the immune system. So the immune system gets alerted, and then you start eliciting a rejection of the tumor. And that discovery, I'm sorry, this is a complicated slide. Stay with me, it's not that complicated. This is a schema of the tumor on the left, the cancer cells. If you apply ionizing radiation together with some specific type of immunotherapy that by itself will not work, so you have to do the two together, you have a mixed set of signals, and then somehow it goes to the draining lymph nodes where it can build an immune response. And if it is successful, and now the immune system is awakened to recognize this, the cancer is not self, it builds an entire population of new lymphocytes that come back and attack the primary tumor, the one you irradiated, but also now use that tumor as a vaccine, the same way we immunize ourselves and our children against an infectious disease. And now that memory that comes with the vaccine, so if you got, measles immunization when somebody next to you is, sneezing or coughing with measles, you are capable to reject it. You are prepared to recognize it as non-self and fight it back. That kind of information stays with the patient and now can attack also metastatic disease. And most importantly, this very complicated concept in breast cancer, sometimes it comes back like 10 years later, 40 years later. It means that it's been asleep for all those years. Maybe if you have an alerted immune system, it keeps it asleep. It doesn't awaken anymore. So we've been working on it for 18 years. We're far from being done. It's one step at a time. It's getting into clinical trials. We were very fortunate to be funded and to get a lot of support for this line of research. And now we have to do this pitch. We have a brand new center at Weill Cornell. Incredible breast center is just opening. And we really hope to make it available to more and more patients. So thank you, and I think we should go back.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Even though the hour is late, we have a few minutes for your questions. And so if you certainly want to submit some more, we'll try to encompass them. A lot of the questions really centered around genetic testing. Should everybody be tested? What about the home kits, 23andMe? And what about some of the other cancer genes that you mentioned, like the ATM? That's part one. Part two is also, what's the difference between testing your own genes and testing the tumor's genes? Elisa.
So I think this is a really important emerging area. As I mentioned, BRCA1 and BRCA2 are genes that we've known about for about 20 years. There are 4 validated New York State approved tests for genetic testing companies, Myriad and Ambry and so forth. 23andMe, what we call DTC, direct to consumer. Basically what we say is we have to proceed with caution because these tests are not fully validated and they're actually in New York State not approved. So if you spit in a cup and send your gene test off to 23andMe or one of the multiple other direct-to-consumer tests, the reason why you need to proceed with caution is threefold. One, the tests for specific spots within the gene that may be mutated, and that does cover most of it. But if a large portion of the gene is removed, also making it non-functional, the direct-to-consumer test can't test for that. So there are what we call false negatives, meaning they say the test is normal, but the gene is really not. 2, the opposite is also true. These tests can have false positives. So if someone walks into my office with a BRCA test that say they test positive for a BRCA mutation, I would never, ever bring them to surgery unless it was validated by one of the tried and true tests. And lastly, to segue into the question about ATM, most of the direct-to-consumer tests don't test for the other newer genes. PALB2, CHEK2, ATM. These 3 genes are all associated with a higher risk of breast cancer and potentially other cancers as well. So it's important to know the BRCA gene is breast, ovarian, prostate, pancreatic, melanoma. If you test positive for one of these other genes, yes, it's an elevated risk of breast cancer, but it may not involve risk to some of the other tumor types. It's its own constellation. So, for example, PALB2 is associated with an increased risk of breast cancer, and we say that risk is about 20 to 40%. The same for ATM. But a lot of that depends on whether you're going to act on that gene. A lot of that depends on also taking a very detailed look at the family history and how that gene is played out. So really, direct-to-consumer testing has come about because we're not doing enough testing. But the problem is that with those mechanisms in place, not doing enough testing, people are reverting to this kind of thing. It's important if you choose to do this kind of thing that you proceed with caution. And the best way to get genetic testing is within the context of seeing a doctor, a clinician who can explain the findings.
Thanks so much. So many of the questions asked very practical approach to exercise. So yes, I mean, there were so many questions. How much? How often? What's the impact in terms of, body fat? As you may remember, if you were here last year, Andy Dannenberg spoke about thin women who have excess body fat and their cancer risks. So give us some guidelines for the prevention strategy for the woman who's not undergoing chemotherapy at the moment.
Okay, I will try. It's actually very hard to give generalized guidelines because I actually don't believe in generalized guidelines. I'm sure all of you out there are not interested in what most people should do. I'm sure you're interested in what you should be doing. But if you look at the exercise guidelines for all healthy Americans, actually are 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise or 5 days a week for 30 minutes. Now, they're the guidelines for every single person in this room, including cancer patients and survivors. And I don't necessarily agree with that because everybody in this room is a little bit different. So it's hard for me to say what most people should be aiming for. But what I will say is I think what I try to talk about a little bit on my presentation is I think we get into habits. We're creatures of habit. We'll go on our favorite bike, our favorite treadmill. You might go on your favorite walk, and you might do this 3 to 4 days a week. And you go at the same speed, and you go on the same route, or you might go on your favorite treadmill. And if anybody's on your treadmill, then hey, that's it, the gloves are off. But I think we get into that habit of doing the same thing every time we go to exercise. And although that's much more beneficial, of course, than doing nothing, the trick is really to modulate the duration and the intensity of your exercise. So I think what we tend to do is, I think particularly the mentality in New York is if you exercise and if you don't work out and you feel like you're going to be sick, then you haven't exercised enough. And I think, and so we have this mentality that we have to exercise like crazy to get a benefit, and that's strictly not true. It strictly is not true. So what we need to be doing is exercising anywhere from between 55% of your maximum all the way up to about 90% of your maximum. And so the majority of your exercise per week should actually be at a relatively low intensity, what we call long, slow distance. So low intensity for a longer duration. So this would be like the slow, boring type workouts. You should be doing that kind of 2 to 3 days a week. One of those sessions then should be a moderate intensity workout, which is, 30 to 45 minutes in duration, about 70%. At the end of that, you should feel pretty spent. And then just twice a week, maybe even once a week, should be a really hard, intense session. 20 to 30 minutes, and at the end of that, if somebody put a gun to your head, there's no way you could do any more. So it's really, you need to balance that stimulus, because exercise is a form of stress, and the way you would respond to exercise is during recovery. So if you never have time to recover, you'll never get the full benefit of exercise. So that's really the trick. If you talk to an athlete, that's the way that they would train, that's the way that I train, and it's really maximizing that response. But rest and recovery is so important. So typically what we do, we do our easy sessions too hard, and we don't do our hard sessions hard enough, so everything gravitates to the middle. And so we do the same stimulus every single time, and we need to be exercising at the extremes.
I think that's super helpful. That's great. I mean, I always ask my patients if they're doing what we call la-di-da exercise, if they're just like humming along on the treadmill, humming along on the bike, and no real effort. So that's super helpful. So a lot of questions for Sylvia came up. Is there a future to a breast cancer vaccine, and might some of the data that you are gathering from your immunotherapy trials be eventually applied to that kind of preventive treatment?
Sure. So several, groups, and certainly the National Breast Cancer Coalition is very much focused on developing a breast cancer vaccine. There is a complexity about it. We are, I help them, and we're part, so I can say we are part of negotiating with the FDA about which population should we test the first vaccine we have developed, and is not an easy call because you don't know how easily tolerated will be. And in theory, vaccines should be given to healthy women, and ideally, from what we know in breast cancer, healthy young women, because you want to give them the way we immunize early in life, you want to give them protection for life. So, and is it correct to give it to BRCA mutation carriers, because they are really a tiny skewed subset of the population? And maybe, so we're looking at where to test it first. We have prepared a vaccine that has some really interesting antigens to react against, which are associated with stem cells. But then the same stem cells are part of somehow repair and regeneration of many tissues. So what would be the toxicity? So there is a complexity about it. But the concept of trying to immunize against the mutations that drive breast cancer and make breast cancer very aggressive is very much in the mind of many. Keep in mind that many, there is a large spectrum of breast cancer. Many breast cancer are indolent, so they really don't progress to become metastatic. So you want to really create a vaccine that prevents the difficult breast cancers, the ones that become metastatic, eventually can be fatal. Not so much to focus on the ones that don't matter, but we're still not that good at separating them. And in fact, there is a lot of debate on how much is the cancer itself, how much is the host, how much is the crosstalk between the cancer and the host. So, as much as I think a vaccine against cancer in general will be great, but it may, and then the risk is, like, for instance, if you immunize against the wrong type of cancer, maybe the more fatal ones are going to go up in incidence, right? So you're going to be protected from one type but not others. So there are a lot of concerns that come up. I think, personally, I believe the most progress will occur the way it is occurring in other tumors, like non-small cell lung cancer, the most common form of lung cancer in men and women, whereby you are going to treat people with advanced disease, either locally advanced or metastatic disease, and see progress in them, in that group. The way we are seeing now possibly some cures in metastatic melanoma. So this is unheard of, that a disease that was consistently take lives, and often young lives. Now we see people alive and well 15, 20 years later with no other treatment, and that is incredible.
Thank you. One question that comes up in many of the panelists' presentations is, what are the other lifestyle things that patients really need to know about? I mean, what about alcohol? What about organic solvents? What about exposures that we have in everyday life? And particularly, a lot of you asked about alcohol. It's a happy crowd, little exercise, little alcohol, good for the mood, good for the mood. So, but what are the data? What do you tell your patients about these kinds of lifestyle modifications?
For alcohol, yeah. Alcohol.
Yes, so alcohol is a very common topic, and it's one of the lifestyle factors, really, that I ask all my patients about when they're newly diagnosed. And I think it's important to know that most of my philosophy in terms of health and what the data support is moderation across many different factors. Alcohol is one of them. What we say is that we know we have pretty good data to support the fact, and I'd be interested to hear Lee's perspective as well, that more than 1 to 2 drinks a day every day. So if you do the math over the course of the week, that's 7 to 14 drinks a week. So 1 to 2 a day doesn't sound like a lot, but it really does add up. And if you think about it more importantly, if you're doing it every day, that's called a habit, okay? And so when you are talking about alcohol, what we try to say is in moderation. And in general, the definition for moderation is, and you can apply this to soy, you can apply this to a variety of different dietary factors, is moderation is 3 to 5 servings a week, which if you think about it makes sense, because that means you're not doing it every day, okay, because that would be 7 a week. And it also gives you wiggle room that if you're out on a Saturday night and you want to have a drink and a cocktail and a glass of wine, that's okay too. And that's usually what's considered safe. And the reason that we think that alcohol increases the risk of breast cancer is because, as we all know, alcohol is metabolized by the liver, okay? But guess what? So are hormones breaking down. So if you think about it, if the liver is so busy breaking down alcohol and fighting to metabolize alcohol, it doesn't have as much bandwidth to break down the hormones. And so what ends up happening is the hormones don't get broken down, and you probably have more circulating hormone levels, which, as we know, can increase the risk of some types of breast cancer. So my general advice is don't become nihilistic. I do find sometimes, sadly, that patients who get breast cancer, always the first question is, what did I do to bring this on? And it is an opportunity. I always say it's an opportunity to intervene if there are unhealthy factors like lack of exercise, like obesity. Those are all real things. So it's an opportunity for intervention. But we try not to point fingers and say, you gave yourself breast cancer because you drink 1 to 2 glasses a night. So 3 to 5 a week is probably a safe number.
Thank you so much. The other interconnect that I find fascinating between alcohol and breast cancer and other cancers is the sugar connection, because there are emerging data from our cancer center director, Dr. Formenti, Dr. Lou Cantley, as well as many others, that the insulin secretion and the insulin gene lies very close to some of the tumor suppressor genes. And so the association between high fat states, diabetes, and certain cancers is really emerging now. And there have been some studies that suggested that if you were on a diabetes drug that decreased your sugar and decreased your insulin, that you might actually do better with certain cancers in the long run. And there are, in fact, some major center studies now, multi-center studies going on, enrolling patients to see prospectively if taking metformin or another diabetes drug preventively will affect their incidence of cancer and how they do with their cancer. So, I mean, to me, that's the other very interesting thing about the sugar wine connection. And several people asked for Adam in terms of the applicability of AI to mammography and some of the other techniques. Is it happening outside Mass General now? Are there other places that are doing the studies looking at the application?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge in bringing the kind of technology is about a scale. So right now we've done a lot of work with Mass General. I know there's some work at a partnership between NYU and Mount Sinai that's produced some papers recently on breast mammography. We're now starting to collaborate with Stanford and the Detroit hospital system in collaboration with Peru. So there's kind of like the biggest challenge in these kind of projects is that the scale is really what lets you learn the signal. You're trying to learn a very complicated and heterogeneous disease. And a lot of times a single center, even in 10 years of data, might not have enough, even though it's an incredibly prevalent disease. And so the kind of the path forward here is kind of this multi-center style model where you actually have to pool the data and share it together. And that's been a large challenge to get started. And so even though there's relatively few computer scientists involved, and I think it's in part because of these access challenges. But I think that's changing and will continue to change into the future.
Thank you. I'd like to, because the hour is late, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and thank our panelists, our speakers. Uh, Thank the champions, the sponsors, Old Oaks, Ellen, Yanni, and everybody who made this morning possible. We're very excited about furthering this research, bringing it out to all of you, and we thank you so much for being here this morning. And some of the speakers have to get back, but they will linger for a few moments for, to meet you. And anyone who wants a cookie, no holds barred.